The billionaire took her virginity, but broke down when she said, "You never loved me." Hello, let's hear another incredible story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. I love narrating stories for you, so get ready. Let's start. The golden autumn leaves danced lazily outside the window of Emory University's library, creating a silent ballet that Isabella Washington watched between pauses in her reading. At 21, she possessed that natural beauty that bloomed without artifice, dark skin that glowed softly under the light filtered through the curtains, carefully braided hair that framed a face where intelligence manifested through deep, expressive brown eyes. "Bella, you're going to miss another party if you keep yourself glued to those books," said Alicia, her roommate, dropping into the chair beside her with a theatrical sigh. "It's Friday night, girl. There are other things in life besides Jane Austen and Virginia Woolf." Isabella smiled without looking away from the pages before her. Is there anything better than discovering how these women managed to capture the human soul in words? She closed the book delicately, like someone handling something sacred. Every sentence is a small revelation about who we are inside. "You talk as if books were your only windows to the world," Alicia observed, not without affection. "But what about living your own stories, creating your own revelations?" The question echoed in Isabella's chest with a pang of melancholy she preferred not to examine too closely. Raised by her grandmother Dorothy after her parents' premature death in a car accident when she was only 12, Isabella had learned early that life could be fragile and unpredictable. Dorothy's wisdom had been clear. "Child, keep your feet on the ground and your heart protected. The world out there can be cruel to dreaming girls like you." "My stories will come in due time," Isabella replied, arranging her books in an organized pile. "Grandma always said the best things in life are those worth waiting for." Alicia rolled her eyes affectionately. "Your grandmother was a wise woman, but I bet she also lived a little before she found your grandfather. You can't spend your whole life waiting for Prince Charming, Bella." "It's not about Prince Charming," Isabella protested, though a subtle blush colored her cheeks. "It's about true connection, about finding someone who sees beyond the surface, who's interested in my thoughts, my dreams. Someone who understands that giving your heart isn't just a physical gesture, it's surrendering your entire soul to another person. You're talking about love like it's Victorian literature." Alicia laughed, but there was tenderness in her voice. "The real world is more complicated than novels, sweetheart." Isabella stood up, adjusting the vintage purse that was an inheritance from her mother, one of the few personal objects that remained after the accident. The brown leather was faded by time, but she polished it religiously every week, keeping it as a talisman of connection to the strong women who came before her. "Maybe it is," Isabella conceded, walking toward the library exit. The late afternoon sun painted everything in golden hues, and she paused for a moment, watching the students crossing the campus courtyard. Some walked in groups, laughing loudly. Others hurried alone, absorbed in their phones. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going, what they wanted from life. "But I'd rather wait for something real than settle for something empty," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Grandma Dorothy used to tell me stories about how she met Grandpa. She said that when she saw him for the first time, it was like recognizing a piece of her own soul in someone else's eyes. That's what I want, Alicia. That recognition, that certainty." Alicia caught up with her, linking their arms as they walked. "What if that certainty doesn't exist? What if love is messier, more uncertain than your grandmother's stories?" Isabella was quiet for a long moment, feeling the weight of her mother's purse against her hip. Inside, she carried not just her belongings, but also a small leather journal where she wrote her thoughts, her dreams, fragments of stories that one day she hoped to transform into something beautiful. "Then I'll write my own story," she finally said, a spark of determination lighting up her eyes. "I'll create the kind of love I believe in. The kind that transforms people, that makes them want to be better versions of themselves." As they walked across campus, neither of them could imagine that in just 3 days, Isabella Washington would meet the man who would challenge everything she believed about love, dreams, and the fragile line between fairy tales and heartbreak. The conference poster they passed, Technology and Humanity, Silicon Valley, Leaders Speak, seemed innocuous enough, just another academic event in a university full of them. But destiny, Isabella would soon learn, often arrives disguised as an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, carrying with it the power to rewrite everything you thought you knew about yourself. The auditorium buzzed with the kind of intellectual energy that made Isabella's heart race. She clutched her worn leather notebook against her chest, scanning the crowd of students, professors, and business professionals who had gathered for the Technology and Humanity conference. She'd almost skipped this event. Literature majors weren't exactly the target audience for Silicon Valley moguls, but Professor Williams had insisted. "You write about the human condition, Isabella," he'd said earlier that week. "These tech leaders are shaping how humanity connects, communicates, loves. You need to understand their world if you want to write about ours." Now, sitting in the third row, Isabella felt slightly out of place among the computer science students and MBA candidates. Her simple black dress and her mother's vintage purse seemed modest compared to the designer clothes and expensive accessories around her. But she'd learned long ago that true worth wasn't measured by appearances. The moderator, a distinguished woman from the university's business school, stepped up to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our keynote speaker, Damien Cross, CEO and founder of CrossTech Industries, whose innovations have revolutionized artificial intelligence and human interface technology." The applause was thunderous, but Isabella barely heard it. Her breath caught in her throat as a man walked onto the stage with the kind of presence that seemed to bend gravity itself. Damien Cross was tall and lean, his dark hair perfectly styled, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her entire semester's expenses. But it wasn't his obvious wealth that struck her. It was the controlled intensity in his movements, the way his grey eyes swept the audience like a predator assessing territory. When those eyes briefly met hers across the crowded auditorium, Isabella felt something shift inside her chest. Time seemed to slow, and for one impossible moment, the rest of the world faded into background noise. She watched his gaze linger on her face for just a beat longer than necessary before moving on. But that single moment left her feeling exposed, as if he'd somehow seen straight through to her soul. Innovation," Damien began, his voice carrying easily through the auditorium without the microphone, "is born from the willingness to destroy what came before, to tear down comfortable illusions and build something entirely new." Isabella found herself leaning forward, drawn by the contradiction between his words and the slight vulnerability she thought she detected beneath his confident exterior. As he spoke about disruption and transformation, she scribbled notes furiously, but not about technology, about him, about the way his jaw tightened when he mentioned trust, how his hands stilled when he talked about human connection. "The greatest barrier to progress," Damien continued, "isn't lack of resources or technology. It's the human tendency to cling to outdated patterns, to choose comfort over growth. We fear change because we fear losing control." "Who hurt you?" Isabella found herself thinking, her pen hovering over the page. "What made you build these walls so high?" During the Q&A session, hands shot up around the auditorium, questions about market trends, investment strategies, technological disruption. Isabella remained quiet, her questions too personal, too probing for a public forum. "Yes, you in the blue shirt," Damien pointed to a student near the back. "Mr. Cross, you've said that emotional attachment is inefficient in business, but doesn't human connection drive innovation? Don't we create our best work when we're emotionally invested?" Isabella watched Damien's expression harden almost imperceptibly. "Emotional attachment clouds judgment," he replied, his voice cooler now. "The moment you allow personal feelings to influence professional decisions, You've compromised your ability to see clearly. I've built my success on maintaining that clarity." The words stung, even though they weren't directed at her. Isabella felt a strange sadness wash over her, not for herself, but for him. How lonely it must be, she thought, to live in a world where feelings were seen as weaknesses rather than strengths. As the session ended and people began filing out, Isabella gathered her things slowly, still processing everything she'd witnessed. She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice the figure approaching until a shadow fell across her notebook. "You didn't ask a question." Isabella looked up to find Damien Cross standing beside her row, his grey eyes now fixed entirely on her. Up close, he was even more imposing and more beautiful in a way that seemed almost unfair. But there was something else too, something that made her heart skip, genuine curiosity. "Daiki," she started, then stopped, suddenly aware that the auditorium had mostly emptied and they were essentially alone. "My questions weren't appropriate for a public forum." "Meaning?" Isabella stood, slinging her mother's purse over her shoulder. Even in her modest heels, she barely reached his chin. "Meaning they were about you, not your technology." Something flickered in Damien's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or intrigue. "About me? About what happened to make you believe that emotional attachment is a weakness instead of a strength?" The words tumbled out before Isabella could stop them, and she immediately felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm sorry, that was presumptuous." "No," Damien said quietly, and for the first time since he'd taken the stage, his carefully constructed facade seemed to crack slightly. "It wasn't." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken truths hanging between them. Isabella felt the strangest urge to reach out and touch his hand, to offer some kind of comfort to this powerful man who seemed so determined to remain untouchable. "I'm Isabella Washington," she said instead, extending her hand formally. When his fingers closed around hers, Isabella felt a jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with static. His skin was warm, his grip firm but gentle, and for just a moment she thought she saw something vulnerable flicker behind his controlled exterior. "Damien Cross," he replied, though they both knew she already knew his name. "Literature major." Isabella nodded, surprised he'd guessed correctly. "How did you know?" "The way you were taking notes. You weren't writing about what I was saying, you were writing about how I was saying it, about what I wasn't saying." His smile was slight but genuine. "Writers see differently than other people." The observation was so accurate it took Isabella's breath away. Billionaire CEOs don't usually notice literature majors in their audience. They do when the literature major is the only person in the room brave enough to see past the performance to the man underneath. The words hung between them, loaded with implications that Isabella wasn't sure she was ready to explore. But before she could respond, Damien's phone buzzed insistently. The moment shattered like glass as he glanced at the screen, and Isabella watched his wall slam back into place. "I have to go," he said, but his eyes lingered on her face. "Isabella Washington." He said her name like he was memorizing it, and something deep in Isabella's chest fluttered with dangerous possibility. As he walked away, Isabella sank back into her seat, her heart racing. She opened her notebook and looked at the page where she'd been taking notes. Instead of academic observations, she'd written a single line over and over in unconscious loops. "What are you running from?" Isabella had convinced herself that their encounter was a fluke, a brief moment of connection that would fade into memory like every other conference she'd attended. She'd spent the weekend writing about their meeting, trying to capture the strange electricity she'd felt, the way his eyes had seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed defenses. But by Monday morning, she'd filed it away as an interesting experience, nothing more. That illusion shattered when she walked into her favorite coffee shop near campus and found Damien Cross sitting at her usual corner table, reading a copy of Jane Eyre. "And you're kidding me," Isabella breathed, stopping short in the doorway. Damien looked up, and that same devastating smile from the auditorium curved his lips. "Miss Washington, What a coincidence. Is it? Isabella approached cautiously, her heart already betraying her with its accelerated rhythm. Because this is a very specific coffee shop in a very specific part of Atlanta, and you live in San Francisco. I do indeed. He closed the book and gestured to the empty chair across from him. But I had some business to finish here. Isabella remained standing, clutching her vintage purse like armor. What kind of business? The kind that involves understanding why a literature major can see things that rooms full of business executives miss entirely. His grey eyes were intense, studying her with the same focus he'd probably used to build his empire. Sit with me, Isabella, please. The way he said her name, like it was something precious he was learning to hold, made her knees weak. Against her better judgment, she sat. How did you find me? I asked around. Turns out you're somewhat famous on campus. The girl who reads Jane Austen in coffee shops and writes stories about broken people finding themselves. He pushed a steaming cup toward her. Large coffee, 2 sugars, splash of cream. Was I right? Isabella stared at the cup, then at him. You research my coffee order. I research everything that interests me. His voice dropped lower, more intimate. In you, Isabella Washington, interest me very much. Heat flooded Isabella's cheeks. She'd never had a man look at her the way Damien was looking at her now, like she was a puzzle he was determined to solve, a book he wanted to read cover to cover. It was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. Why, she asked, surprised by her own boldness. You could have any woman you want. Models, actresses, brilliant businesswomen who understand your world. Why a small-town literature student who's never been further from Atlanta than Savannah? Damien leaned forward, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and masculine that made her dizzy. Because those women see dollar signs when they look at me. They see power, status, what I can give them. But you, he paused, his eyes searching her face. You looked at me like you were trying to figure out what was broken inside me. Like you wanted to understand the man, not the myth. Isabella's breath caught. Maybe broken people recognize each other. Are you broken, Isabella? The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Isabella thought about her parents' accident, about growing up too fast, about the walls she'd built around her heart to protect herself from more loss. We all are, in some way, she said softly. The question is whether we let that brokenness define us, or whether we use it to become something stronger. Damien was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. When he spoke again, his voice carried a vulnerability that made Isabella's chest ache. I haven't let anyone get close to me in 5 years, he admitted. I built my life around the principle that emotional attachment is a liability, that caring too much makes you weak, makes you vulnerable to being destroyed. What happened 5 years ago? His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Someone I trusted completely betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. She took everything, my heart, my business secrets, nearly my entire company. I swore after that I'd never make the same mistake twice. Isabella felt a surge of protectiveness for this powerful man who was revealing his deepest wounds. Ah, so why are you here with me? Why are you risking it? Damien reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The touch sent electricity shooting up Isabella's arm, and she saw in his eyes that he felt it too. Because when I walked away from you on Tuesday, I couldn't stop thinking about that question you wrote in your notebook. Then what are you running from? I've been running for so long, Isabella, that I'd forgotten there might be something worth stopping for. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't how these things happened in real life. Billionaires didn't fall for small-town girls, didn't bare their souls over coffee and college hangouts. But the sincerity in Damien's eyes, the way his thumb was tracing gentle circles on her knuckles, made her want to believe in fairy tales again. I'm not going to lie to you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to play games. I don't know how to be casual about feelings or pretend I don't care when I do. If you're looking for someone who can keep things light and uncomplicated, I'm not that girl. Good, Damien said, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. Because I'm tired of light and uncomplicated. I want to know everything about you, Isabella. What makes you laugh, what makes you cry, what you dream about when you think no one is watching. That's dangerous territory, Isabella warned, though her heart was singing. The best things always are. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. Have dinner with me tonight. Let me show you my world. Isabella knew she should say no. Every rational part of her brain was screaming warnings about the impossibility of their situation, the inevitable heartbreak that would come from falling for someone so far outside her reality. But when she looked into Damien's eyes, she saw something that made her grandmother's voice echo in her memory. Sometimes, child, you have to take a leap of faith. Okay, she whispered, and watched as Damien's careful composure finally cracked into a smile that was pure, unguarded joy. 7 o'clock. I'll pick you up. As Isabella walked back to campus, her mother's purse felt lighter on her shoulder, as if the ghosts of the past were finally giving her permission to step into an uncertain but thrilling future. Isabella stood in front of her small dorm closet, paralyzed by indecision. What did one wear to dinner with a billionaire? Her wardrobe consisted mainly of vintage dresses from thrift stores, comfortable jeans, and the few nice pieces her grandmother had bought her for special occasions. Nothing seemed adequate for whatever world Damien was about to introduce her to. Girl, you look like you're about to throw up, Alicia observed from her bed, where she was supposedly studying, but had been watching Isabella's fashion crisis with growing amusement. I don't belong in his world, Alicia, Isabella said, holding up a simple black dress against herself in the mirror. What was I thinking? You were thinking that a gorgeous, successful man is interested in you, and instead of analyzing it to death, you decided to see where it goes. Alicia got up and pulled a different dress from Isabella's closet, a deep emerald green number that Isabella had bought on impulse but never worn. This one, it brings out your eyes and makes you look like the intelligent, beautiful woman you are. At exactly 7 o'clock, Isabella's phone buzzed with a text. I'm downstairs. Isabella's breath caught when she saw Damien waiting beside a sleek black Tesla outside her dormitory. He changed from his business attire into dark jeans and a navy blazer that made his grey eyes look almost silver. When he saw her approaching, his face lit up with an expression of genuine wonder that made her stomach flutter. You look incredible, he said, opening the passenger door for her with an old-fashioned gallantry that seemed natural rather than practiced. Thank you, Isabella replied, trying not to stare at how the dashboard of his car probably cost more than her entire year's tuition. And where are we going? Somewhere we can actually talk, Damien said, pulling away from the curb with smooth precision. I want to know everything about you, Isabella Washington, and I have a feeling that's going to take more than one evening. They drove through Atlanta as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Instead of heading toward the city's upscale restaurant district, Damien surprised her by pulling into the parking lot of a small Italian place in Little 5 Points, the kind of family-owned restaurant that looked unassuming from the outside, but was beloved by locals. I did my research, Damien explained, noticing her surprised expression. Your favorite restaurant. You come here every month to celebrate finishing another chapter of whatever story you're working on. Isabella stared at him, unsure whether to be flattered or unnerved by his thoroughness. You really do research everything. When something matters to me, yes. He came around to open her door, his hand warm and steady as he helped her out. And you matter to me, Isabella. More than I expected. More than I'm comfortable with, but more than I can ignore. The restaurant was intimate and dimly lit, with checkered tablecloths and the kind of authentic Italian atmosphere that money couldn't buy. The owner, Mrs. Romano, greeted Isabella with the warmth of an old friend. Bella, and who is this handsome young man? She asked, her eyes twinkling with matchmaker's glee. Mrs. Romano, this is Damien. Damien, this is Mrs. Romano. She makes the best tiramisu in Georgia. Any friend of our Isabella's is family here, Mrs. Romano declared, leading them to a corner table lit by candlelight. "I'll bring you the special." As they settled into their seats, Isabella felt some of her nervousness fade. This wasn't the intimidating world of champagne and caviar she'd expected. This was thoughtful, personal. He'd brought her somewhere that mattered to her. Tell me about your writing," Damien said once they'd ordered wine. "What kind of stories do you create?" Isabella hesitated, swirling the red wine in her glass. "Stories about people finding themselves after they've been broken, about second chances and the courage it takes to trust again." She looked up at him. "Stories about healing, I suppose. Is that what you're doing?" "Healing?" The question was gentle but probing, and Isabella felt exposed under his intent gaze. "Aren't we all? You said yourself that you've been running for 5 years. That sounds like someone who's still healing too." Damien was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the tablecloth. "Her name was Natasha," he said finally. "My business partner and more. We built Crosstech together from nothing. I thought we were building our future together too." Isabella reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, offering silent support. "She sold our entire client database to our biggest competitor," Damien continued, his voice carefully controlled. "Took half our staff with her. But worse than that, she did it the night after I told her I loved her, the night after I'd started planning to propose." Isabella's heart ached for him. "Damien, I almost lost everything. Had to rebuild from scratch, work 18-hour days for 2 years just to survive. But the worst part wasn't the financial loss. It was realizing that I'd been completely wrong about someone I'd trusted with everything." "So you decided never to trust again?" "Exactly." He turned his hand, palm up, lacing their fingers together. "Until a beautiful literature student looked at me like she could see straight through to my soul and asked what I was running from." The waiter brought their food, but neither of them moved to eat. The moment felt too important, too fragile to break. "What if I hurt you?" Isabella asked quietly. "What if I'm not who you think I am?" Damien's grip on her hand tightened. "What if you don't? What if, for once in my life, I'm right about someone?" He lifted their joined hands and pressed them against his chest, over his heart. "I can feel my pulse racing just from touching you, Isabella. That's never happened to me before. Never." Isabella could indeed feel his heartbeat, strong and rapid beneath her palm. Her own heart was answering in kind, and she realized with crystalline clarity that she was already falling for this complicated, wounded, brilliant man. "This is dangerous," she whispered, echoing her words from the coffee shop. "The best things always are," he repeated, his eyes dark with promise. "But I swear to you, Isabella, I will never hurt you the way I was hurt. I will never make you question your worth or your trust. You're too precious for that." As Isabella looked into his eyes, seeing sincerity and vulnerability and something that looked dangerously like love, she made a choice that would change everything. She chose to believe him. She chose to trust. She chose to fall. 3 months later, Isabella had never believed in fairy tales until Damien Cross made her the heroine of one. Every Friday, without fail, his private jet touched down at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. Every Friday, Isabella found herself whisked away from her ordinary world of textbooks and coffee shops into something that felt impossibly magical. Weekend trips to his penthouse in San Francisco, where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glittering bay, and she could write her stories while watching the fog roll in like a living thing. "You're spoiling me," Isabella said one Saturday morning, curled up in his massive bed, wearing one of his button-down shirts, her laptop balanced on her knees. Damien was working at his desk, but she could feel his eyes on her every few minutes, as if he needed to reassure himself she was really there. "Good," he replied, abandoning his computer entirely to join her on the bed. "I want to spoil you. I want to give you everything you've ever dreamed of, and things you didn't even know you wanted." He'd already given her so much. The vintage typewriter he'd had restored when she mentioned loving the sound of mechanical keys. The first edition copy of Jane Eyre that now sat on her nightstand in her dorm room. But more than the gifts, it was the way he listened to her, really listened, when she talked about her stories, her dreams, her fears about the future. "Tell me about this one," Damien said, nodding toward her laptop screen. "What are you working on?" Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks. It's about us, actually. About a girl who thinks she knows what love looks like from books, and then meets someone who shows her it's nothing like she imagined, that it's messier and scarier and more beautiful than any story she's ever read. Damien's eyes darkened with an emotion Isabella couldn't quite name. "And how does it end?" "I don't know yet," Isabella admitted. "I'm still living it." He kissed her then, soft and deep, and Isabella melted into him the way she always did. Even after 3 months, his touch still made her dizzy, still made her forget everything but the way he made her feel. Precious, desired, completely and utterly loved. That afternoon, they walked through Union Square hand in hand, and Isabella marveled at how normal it felt, despite the extraordinary circumstances. Damien bought her books from a sidewalk vendor, listened patiently while she explained why certain passages moved her, carried her bags without complaint when she got carried away in a vintage clothing store. "My grandmother would have loved you," Isabella said, as they sat in a small cafe, sharing a piece of chocolate cake that was probably worth more than her weekly grocery budget. "Tell me about her," Damien said, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing between them. "She was everything to me after my parents died. Strong, wise, fiercely protective. She used to say that the right person would make me want to be brave enough for love." Isabella looked up at him, her heart swelling with emotion that still sometimes overwhelmed her. "I think she would have seen what I see in you. What do you see in me?" It was a question he asked often, as if he still couldn't quite believe someone could look at him and see beyond the wealth, the power, the carefully constructed image. "I see someone who's been hurt but is brave enough to try again. Someone who works 18-hour days but still flies across the country every weekend just to hold me while I sleep. Someone who pretends to be made of steel but cries during sad movies when he thinks I'm not looking." Damien laughed. "I don't cry during movies." "You absolutely do. Last week during The Notebook, you had to get up and get tissues. That was allergies. In your climate-controlled penthouse. Severe allergies." Isabella grinned, standing up and moving to sit in his lap right there in the crowded cafe. She didn't care who was watching, didn't care about the stares or the whispered comments about the odd couple in the corner. All she cared about was the way Damien's arms immediately came around her, holding her like she was something infinitely precious. "I love you," she whispered against his ear, words that had become as essential as breathing over the past month. "And I love your brilliant mind and your secret soft heart and the way you make me feel like I can conquer the world." "I love you too," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I thought I was capable of loving anyone. You've changed everything for me, Isabella, everything." 6 months after their first meeting, Isabella had never been happier in her life. Her senior thesis was nearly complete, a collection of short stories about love, loss, and second chances that her advisor called exceptional. Graduation was only 2 months away, and she'd been accepted to Columbia's MFA program in New York. Damien had already promised to help her find the perfect apartment, had talked about opening a New York office for Crosstech, so they could be together. Their relationship had settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as sunrise. Weekends in San Francisco, long phone calls during the week, text messages that made her smile in the middle of lectures. Damien had even flown down for her birthday, surprising her with a party at Mrs. Romano's restaurant, where he'd somehow convinced her favorite professor and all her friends to gather. But it was the quiet moments Isabella treasured most. The way he'd hold her after they made love, his fingers tracing patterns on her skin while she drifted towards sleep. The way he'd read her stories and offer thoughtful feedback, treating her dreams with the same seriousness he brought to his business empire. The way he'd started talking about their future together as if it were inevitable, beautiful, written in the stars. "I want to meet your grandmother," he'd said just last weekend, and Isabella's heart had nearly burst with joy. "I want to take you to her grave," Isabella had replied, "and I want to tell her about you." Standing in her dorm room now, Isabella looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. She glowed with happiness, with love, with the confidence that came from being cherished by someone extraordinary. Her mother's vintage purse sat on her desk, and sometimes Isabella could swear she felt her parents' approval, their joy that their daughter had found someone who made her shine. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow, Damien would come for her again, and they would have another perfect weekend in their bubble of happiness. Isabella had no way of knowing that tomorrow would be the last Friday she would see his face for 3 months. Had no way of knowing that the man who'd promised never to hurt her was about to shatter her heart into pieces so small she'd wonder if it could ever be whole again. Tonight, she was still living in their fairy tale. Tomorrow, she would learn that not all fairy tales have happy endings. The penthouse was bathed in the soft glow of candlelight when Isabella emerged from the bathroom, her heart hammering against her ribs. 6 months of gentle touches, heated kisses, and whispered promises had led to this moment, the night she would finally give Damien not just her body, but the last piece of her soul that she'd been protecting since her parents died. She'd chosen the white silk nightgown carefully, something that made her feel beautiful and feminine rather than exposed. Her hands trembled slightly as she walked toward the bedroom, where Damien waited by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his shirt unbuttoned, silver moonlight painting his skin. "You're shaking," he said softly, turning to face her. The expression in his grey eyes was so tender, so full of love, that Isabella felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. I'm nervous," she admitted, wrapping her arms around herself. I've never felt ready before. But with you, I want to be brave." Damien crossed the room in 3 quick strides, taking her face in his hands with infinite gentleness. "We don't have to do anything you're not ready for, Isabella. We have all the time in the world." "That's just it," Isabella whispered, leaning into his touch. "I don't want to wait anymore. I love you, Damien. I trust you completely. I want to give you everything." Something flickered across Damien's face, an emotion too quick to catch, gone before Isabella could interpret it. But then he was kissing her, slow and reverent, pouring 6 months of restrained desire into the connection between them. "Are you sure?" he asked against her lips. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." What followed was nothing like the clinical descriptions in books or the hurried encounters she'd heard her friends describe. Damien made love to her like she was something sacred, something to be worshipped. Every touch was deliberate, every kiss a promise. When tears leaked from the corners of Isabella's eyes, not from pain, but from the overwhelming emotion of finally, completely belonging to someone, he kissed them away and whispered her name like a prayer. Afterward, they lay tangled in silk sheets, Isabella's head on Damien's chest as his fingers combed through her hair. She could hear his heartbeat, strong and steady beneath her ear, and she'd never felt so complete, so perfectly where she belonged. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness, pressing a soft kiss to his skin. "I love you so much it terrifies me sometimes." Damien's hand stilled in her hair for just a moment, so briefly Isabella almost missed it. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I love you too, Isabella, more than I ever thought possible." She fell asleep, listening to his heartbeat, her grandmother's vintage purse visible on the nightstand beside them, a silent witness to this moment when Isabella Washington finally became a woman who had chosen love over fear. But Damien didn't sleep. He lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling as the woman he loved more than life itself slept trustingly in his arms. The weight of what had just happened, what she had just given him, pressed down on his chest like a physical thing. "I want to give you everything." Her words echoed in his mind, and with them came a terror so complete it nearly stopped his breathing. She had given him everything, her body, her trust, her pure and innocent heart. She looked at him with such complete faith, such absolute love, that he'd felt simultaneously like the luckiest man alive and a fraud who didn't deserve a single moment of her devotion, because the truth was, Isabella Washington had become his entire world. She'd taken the carefully constructed walls around his heart and demolished them so completely that he couldn't remember who he'd been before her. When she smiled, his chest expanded with joy. When she cried, he felt physical pain. When she said she loved him, he believed in miracles, and that terrified him more than losing his company ever had. The vulnerability was suffocating. The knowledge that someone held the power to destroy him with a single word, a single betrayal, made his skin crawl with familiar panic. Natasha had taught him that love was weakness, that caring too much made you prey. Isabella had made him forget that lesson, had made him believe that maybe, just maybe, he could be different this time. But lying there in the dark, holding the sleeping girl who'd just given him her everything, Damien Cross remembered why he'd sworn never to let anyone get this close again. By dawn, the fear had crystallized into a decision that would haunt them both. By dawn, the man who'd promised never to hurt her was planning his escape. Isabella woke to sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows and the sound of the shower running. She stretched languorously in the silk sheets, her body deliciously sore, in ways that made her blush and smile simultaneously. Last night had been perfect, more beautiful and intimate than any fantasy she'd ever dared to have. She could hear Damien moving around in the bathroom, and her heart fluttered with anticipation of seeing him, of morning kisses and whispered endearments, of planning their day together. Maybe they'd visit that little bookstore in North Beach he'd mentioned, or take a walk along the pier while he told her more about his plans to expand Crosstech to New York. "Good morning, handsome," she called out, wrapping the sheet around herself as she padded toward the bathroom. Last night was... She stopped short in the doorway. Damien stood at the marble counter, fully dressed in a crisp business suit, his hair perfectly styled, his face a mask of cold professionalism she hadn't seen since that first day in the auditorium. He was adjusting his tie in the mirror, and when his eyes met hers in the reflection, there was none of the warmth, none of the love that had been there just hours before. "Oh, you're dressed," Isabella said stupidly, confusion making her voice small. "Emergency at the office," Damien replied without turning around. His voice was clipped, businesslike, as if she were a stranger he was dismissing. "I have to go." Isabella's stomach dropped. "What kind of emergency? I thought we were spending the weekend together." "You said plans change." He finally turned to face her, and the coldness in his grey eyes made Isabella take an involuntary step backward. This wasn't the man who had held her so tenderly last night, who had whispered her name like a prayer. This was the billionaire CEO who viewed emotions as weaknesses and relationships as transactions. "Damien, what's wrong?" Isabella's voice cracked slightly. "Did I do something? Last night was..." He paused, his jaw clenching as if the words physically pained him. "Last night was a mistake." The sheet slipped from Isabella's suddenly numb fingers. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like she was standing naked in front of a stranger who was examining her and finding her lacking. "A mistake," she whispered. "I got carried away. We both did." Damien picked up his briefcase, his movements sharp and efficient. "This whole thing has gone too far. I should have ended it months ago before it got so what? Complicated." The word hit Isabella like a physical blow. Complicated. 6 months of love, of trust, of building a life together, reduced to one clinical word that made it sound like an inconvenience to be managed. "You don't mean that," Isabella said, desperation creeping into her voice. "Last night, you told me you loved me. You said I'd changed everything for you. You can't just..." "I say a lot of things when I'm caught up in the moment." Damien's voice was brutal in its indifference. "But this is reality, Isabella. We're from different worlds. This was never going to work long-term." Isabella felt like she was drowning, like the ground had opened up beneath her feet and she was falling into an abyss. Different worlds. You flew to Atlanta every weekend for 6 months. You talked about New York, about meeting my grandmother. You made me believe it. I made you believe what you wanted to believe. He moved toward the door, and Isabella followed him on unsteady legs, still clutching the sheet around herself. "Please," she whispered, hating the desperation in her voice, but unable to stop it. "Please don't do this. Not like this. Not after last night. Talk to me, Damien. Tell me what's really going on." For just a moment, his step faltered, his hand paused on the doorknob, and Isabella thought she saw a crack in his armor, a glimpse of the man who had made love to her so tenderly just hours before. "Damien," she said softly, reaching out to touch his arm, "I love you. Whatever this is, whatever's scaring you, we can work through it together. That's what people who love each other do." He jerked away from her touch, as if she'd burned him. When he turned to look at her one last time, his eyes were empty of everything that had made him the man she'd fallen in love with. "Goodbye, Isabella." The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the sudden silence. Isabella stood frozen for a long moment, her mind refusing to process what had just happened. Then slowly, she sank to the floor, the sheet pooling around her as sobs tore from her throat. The penthouse that had been her fairy tale sanctuary just hours before now felt like a mausoleum. The rumpled sheets bore witness to a love that had apparently meant nothing to the man who had claimed her heart. The candles from last night, now cold and dark, seemed to mock her naivety. She cried until she had no tears left, until her body was empty of everything but the hollow ache where her heart used to be. Then she got dressed with mechanical precision, gathered her few belongings, and called a taxi to take her to the airport. She left her mother's vintage purse behind on the nightstand, the first time in 10 years she'd gone anywhere without it. Somehow, carrying it felt like carrying the weight of every broken promise, every shattered dream. As the plane lifted off from San Francisco, Isabella pressed her face to the window and watched Damien's city disappear into the clouds below. Somewhere down there, the man she'd given everything to was probably already back at his office, burying himself in work, pretending she'd never existed. The girl who had believed in fairy tales was gone. In her place sat a woman who now understood that sometimes love wasn't enough. 2 weeks after the disappearance, Isabella sat in her dorm room, staring at her laptop screen, where the cursor blinked mockingly in the middle of an unfinished sentence. She'd been trying to write for days. Her senior thesis was due in 6 weeks, but every time she put her fingers to the keys, all that came out was pain. "Bella, you have to eat something," Alicia said from the doorway, holding a plate of cafeteria food that Isabella knew she wouldn't touch. She hadn't had an appetite since San Francisco. Food tasted like ash. Sleep brought only nightmares of grey eyes and broken promises. "I'm not hungry," Isabella replied automatically, the same response she'd given for 14 days straight. Alicia set the plate down anyway and sat on Isabella's bed, studying her with worried eyes. "He's an asshole, Bella, a coward, and an asshole who doesn't deserve your tears." Isabella almost laughed, but it came out as a broken sound instead. "Do you know what the worst part is? I keep checking my phone. I keep thinking he'll call or text or show up here with some explanation that makes it all make sense. I keep believing he'll come back. Has he tried to contact you at all?" Isabella shook her head. "Nothing. It's like our 6 months together never happened, like I imagined the whole thing." But she hadn't imagined it. The proof was everywhere. In the first edition Jane Eyre that sat on her nightstand, in the vintage typewriter that she couldn't bear to look at, in the expensive clothes hanging in her closet that now felt like costumes from someone else's life. 3 weeks later, Isabella Washington. Isabella looked up from her table at Mrs. Romano's restaurant, where she'd been staring at an untouched plate of pasta for the better part of an hour. A well-dressed woman in her 40s was approaching, her expression carefully neutral. "Yes, my name is Amanda Sterling. I work for Crosstech Industries." The woman sat down without invitation, her movements crisp and professional. "Mr. Cross asked me to give you this." Amanda placed a thick envelope on the table between them. Isabella stared at it like it might bite her. What is it? A settlement agreement. Mr. Cross wants to ensure you're comfortable. As you finish your education and begin your career, there's also information about the Columbia MFA program. He's arranged for your full tuition to be covered, plus living expenses for 2 years in New York. Isabella felt sick. He's paying me off. He's taking care of you, Amanda corrected smoothly. Oh, he asked me to tell you that he hopes you'll accept this gesture in the spirit it's intended, as an apology and an investment in your future. And if I refuse, then you refuse. But Mr. Cross was very clear that he wants to help, regardless of personal complications. Isabella pushed the envelope back across the table. Tell Mr. Cross that I don't want his money. I don't want his guilt payments or his charity. If he wanted to help me, he would have stayed. Amanda left the envelope on the table despite Isabella's rejection. He also asked me to tell you that he watches your interviews. What interviews? The campus newspaper, the literary magazine features. He's proud of your work. Amanda stood, smoothing her skirt. He reads everything you publish. After Amanda left, Isabella sat alone with the envelope, feeling more confused and hurt than ever. If Damien cared enough to follow her career, to pay for her education, why hadn't he simply called? Why this cold, corporate gesture instead of a single word of explanation? 6 weeks later, Isabella was walking across campus after her thesis defense, which had gone brilliantly, her advisor said, despite everything she'd been going through. When she saw the tabloid cover at the campus bookstore, her blood turned to ice. There was Damien, impeccably dressed in a tuxedo, his arm around a stunning blonde at what looked like a charity gala in New York. The headline read, "Silicon Valley Bachelor Back on the Market. Damien Cross steps out with socialite." Isabella bought the magazine with shaking hands and read every devastating word. The article described Damien's brief relationship with a college student as a minor distraction that was now firmly in the past. The blonde, Victoria Ashford, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune, was described as much more suitable for a man of Cross's caliber. That night, Isabella lay in her narrow dorm bed and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her heartbreak. She'd been clinging to hope without even realizing it, hope that maybe Damien was suffering too, that maybe his silence meant he was struggling with their separation as much as she was. But the photos told a different story. He looked perfectly content, perfectly collected, perfectly moved on. She'd been a distraction, a phase, a mistake he'd corrected and forgotten. Isabella pulled her grandmother's purse against her chest and cried until she was empty. Then she made a decision that would have made Dorothy Washington proud. She would not let this break her. She would not let Damien Cross define her worth or her future. She would graduate with honors, go to Columbia, and become the writer she'd always dreamed of being. She would pour her heartbreak into her stories and transform her pain into something beautiful. But first, she would allow herself to grieve the death of her fairy tale. 3 months after San Francisco, Isabella stood in her cap and gown, waiting for her name to be called at graduation. Her thesis advisor had told her that publishers were already interested in her work. Columbia was waiting. Her future stretched ahead of her, bright with possibility, despite the ache that still lived in her chest. She was scanning the crowd of families and friends when she saw him. Damien Cross stood at the back of the auditorium, partially hidden behind a pillar, watching her with an expression of such raw longing that Isabella's breath caught in her throat. Their eyes met across the crowded space, and Isabella saw everything she'd been hoping to see for 3 months: regret, pain, love, desperation. But she also saw something else, the same fear that had driven him away, still there, still controlling him, still making him a coward. When her name was called and she walked across the stage to accept her diploma, Isabella made a choice. Instead of looking for him in the crowd, instead of hoping he might approach her afterward, she kept her eyes forward. If Damien Cross wanted to be part of her life, he would have to find the courage to fight for her. She was done fighting for a man who was too afraid to fight for himself. Isabella was gathering her things after the graduation ceremony when she felt a familiar presence behind her. Her hands stilled on her mother's vintage purse. The same purse that had carried her through 6 months of heaven and 3 months of hell. She didn't need to turn around to know who was standing there. "Hello, Isabella." His voice was exactly as she remembered, deep, controlled, with that slight rasp that used to make her knees weak. Now it just made her angry. Slowly, deliberately, she turned to face the man who had shattered her heart and left her to pick up the pieces alone. Damien looked terrible. Oh, he was still devastatingly handsome in his perfectly tailored suit, still carried himself with that magnetic confidence that commanded attention. But Isabella had learned to read the shadows beneath his careful facade. His grey eyes were haunted, his face thinner than she remembered, and there was a tension in his shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights and guilty conscience. Good, she thought with vicious satisfaction. He should suffer. "What are you doing here, Damien?" Isabella's voice was steady, cold, nothing like the broken girl who had begged him not to leave 3 months ago. "I wanted to see you graduate, to congratulate you." He took a tentative step closer, and Isabella noticed the way his hands trembled slightly before he shoved them into his pockets. "I'm proud of you, Isabella. Your thesis advisor says publishers are already interested in your work." "You spoke to Professor Williams?" Isabella's composure cracked slightly. "You've been checking up on me. I never stopped caring about your success." "Don't." The word came out sharp as a blade. "Don't you dare stand there and pretend you care about me when you disappeared from my life like I meant nothing to you." Damien flinched as if she'd slapped him. "Isabella, I know you're angry." "Angry?" Isabella laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I was angry 3 months ago, Damien. When you walked out of that penthouse like our entire relationship was a business transaction gone wrong. When you had your assistant offer me money like I was some kind of prostitute you needed to pay off. When I saw you in the tabloids with Victoria Ashford, looking perfectly content while I was falling apart. Those photos weren't what they seemed. I don't care." Isabella adjusted her cap, meeting his eyes with the kind of direct gaze that had first intrigued him 9 months ago. But now there was steel in her brown eyes, a hardness that hadn't been there before. "I don't care about your explanations or your excuses. You made your choice, Damien. You chose to run instead of stay and fight for us." "I was protecting you," Damien said desperately, his careful control finally cracking. "Or I was protecting both of us from something that was never going to work. Bullshit." The profanity sounded strange coming from Isabella's lips, but it stopped Damien cold. "You weren't protecting anyone. You were protecting yourself. You were so terrified of being vulnerable, so afraid of potentially getting hurt again, that you hurt me instead. You destroyed the most beautiful thing either of us had ever had because you're a coward." Damien's face went white. "Isabella, no, I'm not finished." Isabella stepped closer, her graduation gown billowing around her like armor. "Do you want to know what you taught me, Damien? You taught me that fairy tales are lies. You taught me that men like you don't end up with girls like me. Not because we're from different worlds, but because you don't have the courage to love someone more than you love your own safety." Tears were streaming down Isabella's face now, but her voice never wavered. "You made me believe I was special. You made me believe that love could transform people, could make them brave. You looked me in the eyes while you made love to me and told me I was everything to you. And then you threw it all away because I loved you too much, and that terrified you." "You're right," Damien whispered, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "You're absolutely right. I was terrified. I am terrified, because loving you, really loving you, means giving you the power to destroy me completely. And I've been destroyed before, Isabella. I didn't think I could survive it again. So instead you destroyed me," Isabella said quietly. "You took a girl who had never given her heart to anyone, who trusted you with everything she was, and you broke her into pieces. Do you have any idea what these 3 months have been like for me? Do you care?" Of course I care, Damien exploded, his composure finally shattering completely. I haven't slept more than 2 hours at a time since I left you in San Francisco. I've started a dozen different letters trying to explain, trying to apologize. I've picked up the phone to call you 100 times. Every business decision I make, I wonder what you'd think. Every sunset I see, I wish you were there to watch it with me. Isabella stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then why didn't you call? Why didn't you come back? Because I knew that if I saw you again, if I heard your voice, I'd fall apart completely. I'd beg you to forgive me, and I'd promise to change, to be better, to be the man you deserve. But what if I can't? What if I hurt you again? What if I'm not capable of the kind of love you need? Isabella was quiet for a long moment, studying the man who had once been her entire world. When she spoke, her voice was soft but devastating. You want to know the difference between us, Damien? I was willing to risk everything for love. I was willing to be vulnerable, to trust, to believe in something beautiful even though it might not last forever. But you'd rather live in your safe, empty penthouse than risk feeling something real. She adjusted her mother's purse on her shoulder, the leather worn smooth by 3 generations of strong women who had loved and lost and survived. The truth is, you never loved me at all, Isabella said, her voice breaking on the words that would destroy them both. Because if you had really loved me, you would have stayed. You would have fought. You wouldn't have been able to walk away. Isabella turned and walked away from Damien Cross for the second time in her life. This time, she didn't look back. You never loved me at all. The words echoed in Damien's mind as he watched Isabella walk away, her graduation gown flowing behind her like the wings of an avenging angel. For a moment, he stood frozen in the emptying auditorium, surrounded by celebrating families and the debris of dreams he'd been too cowardly to fight for. Then the full weight of what she'd said hit him, and Damien Cross, the man who had built an empire through sheer force of will, who had never shown weakness in boardrooms full of sharks, fell to his knees right there on the polished gymnasium floor. You never loved me at all. She was wrong. God, she was so wrong it physically hurt. He loved her more than his next breath, more than his fortune, more than his own life. He loved her so much that the thought of losing her had driven him to lose her anyway, the cruelest irony of his existence. Isabella, wait! The words tore from his throat as he struggled to his feet, pushing past startled graduates and their families. Isabella, please! She was almost to the parking lot when he caught up with her, grabbing her arm with desperate hands. Don't touch me, Isabella said, jerking away from him, but not before Damien saw the tears streaming down her face. You're wrong, he said, his voice breaking completely. You're wrong about everything. I do love you. I love you so much it's killing me. I love you so much that I wake up every morning wishing I'd never walked away, wishing I'd been brave enough to stay and fight for us. Isabella turned to face him, her beautiful face ravaged by pain and fury. Pretty words, Damien, but words are easy. Actions are what matter, and your actions told me exactly how much I meant to you. Then let me show you, Damien said, dropping to his knees again right there in the parking lot, not caring who was watching, not caring about his dignity or his image or anything except the woman standing before him. And let me show you what you mean to me. Isabella stared down at him, shocked into silence by the sight of the powerful billionaire kneeling on asphalt in his $1,000 suit. I am broken, Isabella, Damien said, his voice raw with honesty. Natasha didn't just betray my business. She broke something fundamental inside me. She made me believe that love was just another transaction, that everyone who claimed to care about me had an agenda. And when I met you, he looked up at her, his grey eyes bright with tears he'd never allowed himself to shed. When I met you, you were so pure, so genuine, so full of light that you terrified me, because loving you meant believing in goodness again. It meant trusting that someone could see all my flaws, all my darkness, and choose to stay anyway. Isabella's composure was cracking, her own tears falling freely now. That night in San Francisco, when you gave yourself to me completely, body and soul, I felt something I'd never felt before. Complete and utter terror at how much I needed you. You weren't just in my bed, Isabella. You were in my bloodstream, in my DNA, written into every cell of my being. And that level of vulnerability, that complete dependence on another person's love, it sent me into a panic. Damien reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather journal, Isabella's journal, the one she'd left behind in his penthouse. "I've read every word you ever wrote about us," he confessed. "Every beautiful, heartbreaking word about the girl who learned to love and the man who was too afraid to let himself be loved. You wrote that love requires courage, Isabella. You were right. And I was a coward." Isabella knelt down in front of him, taking her journal with trembling hands. "Damien, I thought I was protecting you by leaving," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought you deserved someone who could love you without fear, without baggage, without the constant terror that you might destroy me the way Natasha did. But all I did was prove that I'm exactly the kind of man who doesn't deserve you." "You're right," Isabella said quietly, and Damien's heart shattered completely. "You don't deserve me, not because you're broken. We're all broken, Damien. But because you chose to stay broken instead of fighting to heal. You chose fear over love, safety over vulnerability, emptiness over me." Damien nodded, accepting her judgment like the death sentence it was. But Isabella continued, her voice softening, "I don't want someone who deserves me. I want someone who chooses me every day, despite the fear. Someone who's willing to risk everything for love, the way I risked everything for you." She reached out and cupped his face in her hands, her touch so gentle it made him want to weep. "I want the man who flew across the country every weekend just to hold me while I slept. I want the man who researched my coffee order and took me to my favorite restaurant because he wanted to know my world. I want the man who cried during sad movies and pretended it was allergies." "Isabella," Damien breathed, hardly daring to hope. "I want you, Damien Cross. Not the perfect version, not the fearless version. You, broken and terrified and willing to kneel in a parking lot to fight for what we had." Her thumbs brushed away his tears. But I need to know that you'll stay this time. I need to know that when the fear comes, and it will come, you'll choose love anyway." "I'll choose you," Damien said fiercely, covering her hands with his. "I'll choose you every time, Isabella. I swear on everything I am, everything I have, I will never walk away from you again. I love you. I love your brilliant mind and your generous heart, and the way you see beauty in broken things. I love you enough to spend the rest of my life proving it." Isabella smiled through her tears, the first real smile Damien had seen from her in 3 months. "Then kiss me," she whispered, "and this time, don't you dare let go." When Damien kissed Isabella Washington in that parking lot, surrounded by the chaos of graduation day, it felt like coming home. It felt like redemption. It felt like the beginning of the fairy tale they both deserved, the one where love conquers fear, where broken people heal each other, and where sometimes, if you're brave enough to fight for it, you get a second chance at forever. Later, much later, Isabella would write their story, the real version, where love isn't perfect, but it's worth fighting for. And Damien would read every word, grateful every day that he'd found the courage to fall to his knees and beg for the love of a woman who taught him that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's the only way to truly live. The end. Did Isabella make the right choice forgiving Damien after everything he put her through? Did he truly change, or was he just terrified of losing her forever? If you were Isabella, could you forgive a man who abandoned you right after you gave him your virginity and your heart? Or does true love really deserve a second chance, even after such a deep betrayal? Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.